Verna Lee Tolliver was 17 years old. She had made every dress she and her two sisters owned out of cotton flour sacks. 3 sacks to a dress. 4, if a girl had grown that year. One spring morning, she walked 4 miles into town in a dress she had cut and sewn herself. She went to ask a white mill office the smallest question a sharecropper's daughter could think to ask. Not for money, not for work, just this: whether she could copy the patterns off the flour bags into her tablet so she could buy the matching ones before the store sold them apart. The clerk laughed at her. Then the manager came out of the back room. He looked at the thin girl standing at his counter in her homemade dress, and for reasons he could not have explained, he asked her a question he had never asked anybody. "Before you copy them," he said, "which of these do you figure sell?" Every man in that room expected her to have no answer. She lifted her hand and pointed. She was right. And she could tell him exactly why. If you've ever done the skilled part of the work and been thanked only for fetching the material, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe to the channel. And do one thing for me. Comment the town where you're watching from. The town your mother or grandmother sewed in. I want to see how far this print still travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning. The town was called Egret, in the flat black bottomland of the Mississippi Delta, and the year was 1938. If you have never stood in that country, picture cotton in every direction. Fields so level a man could see the curve of the earth at the far end of a row. The land belonged to a man named August Delane. Most of the people who worked it did not own the shoes on their feet. The Tollivers were one of those families. Elmer Tolliver and his wife Cleo sharecropped 40 acres of Delane cotton. That meant they did not own the land, or the seed, or the mule, or the plow. They borrowed all of it. Come settlement time in the fall, half the crop went straight to the man who owned the dirt. What was left had to pay back everything the family had lived on since spring, and everything ran through the commissary. That was the plantation store. You did not go to town for your flour and your salt and your coffee. You went to the commissary, and you signed for it, and the price went into a ledger with your name at the top. They called it the furnish. The furnish carried a family through the growing season on credit. It also carried interest. By the time the cotton came in, a family could work all year and end up owing more than they started with. That was not an accident. That was how it was built. Elmer Tolliver understood the arithmetic. He kept his own count in his head all season, and it rarely came out in his favor. Cleo kept the house and the garden and the 4 children, and she kept the peace. And they had one rule between them, spoken so many times it had worn smooth. Keep the family whole. Stay out from under any more than you have to. That rule is why a mill office frightened Cleo Tolliver so badly. To her mind, an office with a white man behind the counter was a place where a cropper's family only ever lost. You did not walk in with something. You walked out with less. There were 4 Tolliver children. The 2 youngest were Docia, who was 13, and Nettie, who was 10. And then there was Verna Lee, the oldest girl, 17 that spring. Here is the thing the family never quite said out loud. Verna Lee did the skilled work of the household. She was not the child who fetched. She was the one who made. When a chair broke, she mended it. When the garden came in, she put it up. And every stitch of clothing on the backs of those 3 girls came off the needle in Verna Lee's hands. But that is not how she was counted. In the family, and in the section, she was known as the girl who carried the sacks home. She would walk to the commissary, and she would come back with 100 pounds of flour balanced on her shoulder. That was the picture people had of her. The carrying, not the making. The whole of her skill lived in a place nobody thought to look. Let me tell you about the making, because it matters more than anything else in this story. Flour did not come in paper in that time and place. Not for a farm family. Flour and feed and meal and sugar came in cotton sacks. Big ones, 100 pounds to a bag. And the mills had learned something. A woman would choose one brand of flour over another because she liked the cloth the flour came in. so the sacks were printed. Little flowers, checks, stripes, small figures in 3 and 4 and 5 colors. The flower inside might be the very same flower, but the bag was a bolt of dress cotton you got for free once the flower was gone. Every farm woman in the South knew this, and every farm woman washed the printing out of the cheap plain sacks and saved the pretty printed ones and turned them into shirts and aprons and curtains and dresses. Verna Lee had made this into an art. 300-pound cotton print sacks made one dress. That was her measure, and she had it down to the inch. Open the sack along the seam, boil out the sizing, press it flat, and you had a good square of cloth. 3 squares, cut right, laid out right. And there was a dress with a yoke, and a placket, and a hem that hung true. A 4th sack if the girl had shot up over the winter. She had cut for herself. She had cut for Dosia and for Nettie, and she had cut for half the girls in the section, whose mothers brought her their saved sacks and a little something in trade, because Verna Lee could get a whole dress out of what they could only get an apron from. She saw cloth the way a carpenter sees a board. She knew where the waist hid. She knew which way a print wanted to be cut. She had never in her life read a word about any of it. She had learned it the only way she could, which was by having almost nothing and having to make it into something anyway. And she had a tablet. It was a school tablet, the cheap kind butcher paper leaves stitched down one side. On those pages in pencil, Verna Lee had copied bag prints, 11 of them, so far. A little rose stripe, a blue check, a scatter of small yellow flowers on a brown ground. She drew them careful and true, the exact repeat, the exact colors noted in her own words at the edge. Bright blue. Egg yellow. Rust. If you had asked her why she did it, she would have looked at you like the answer was plain. So I don't lose a lot when the store breaks it apart, she'd say. And that was all it was to her. A scrimping habit, a way to remember what she was hunting for. Nothing more. She did not know that the tablet held the one thing every man in the flower trade was missing. She did not know her whole eye lived in those pages. To her it was a grocery list drawn in pencil. Keep that tablet in mind. We will come back to it. Now, here is the trouble that sent her to town. The trouble was the store. See, the commissary and the town store both sold flour by the single sack. A woman needed 3 matching sacks for a dress. But the sacks came in on the truck as a lot, and the store did not care whether they stayed together. They sold them one at a time, to whoever came in. So the print you wanted was a moving target. You might get 2 of a kind and never see the third. The lot got broken apart, and the match walked out the door on somebody else's shoulder. That is exactly what happened to Verna Lee that spring. She had a dress planned for Nettie. She had 2 sacks of a pretty small floral put by, saved out, washed and pressed and waiting. She went back for the third. And the third was gone. Sold. The store had no more of that print, and would not have more, because the lot was broken and the truck had moved on. So the dress went one short. She had to piece the yoke out of a plain sack, a different cloth, and anybody with an eye could see the seam where the making went wrong. It was a small thing. In a house that had so little, it was not a small thing at all. Verna Lee sat with that a while, and then she had a thought that no one in her family, and maybe no one in that whole county, had ever had. What if she could see the patterns before the store got them? What if she could know, ahead of the season, which prints were coming? Then she could buy the 3 she needed while the lot was still whole. She would never come up one short again. And the only place that would know what was coming was the mill. The mill was the Tallahatchie Milling Company, in town. They put out flour, and the flour went in printed sacks, and the office would surely have the coming patterns before any store did. She did not want a favor. She did not want charity. She only wanted to look and to copy into her own tablet so she could plan. She told her mother. Cleo Tolliver's face closed like a door. "You will not go up to that office," Cleo said. That is not a place for us to go asking. I'm not asking for anything, Mama, just to look at the bags, just to copy 'em down. Verna, her mother took her by the arm. A cropper's girl walks into a place like that, and it does not go the way you plan. You will be shamed, and you will come home with nothing, and maybe worse than nothing. Leave it be. But Elmer Tolliver, listening from the porch, said a quiet thing. He said, "She's asking to copy. She's not asking to take. There's no harm in a girl copying." And there was, in his voice, a small, unwilling pride he could not keep out of it. So it was settled, more or less. Verna Lee would go. She left before the heat, in the good dress, the one she had made for herself, in a soft green small-figured print she had been lucky to get all 3 sacks of. She had chosen it careful. She wanted to look, walking in, like a girl who knew cloth. She had her tablet under her arm and a pencil in her pocket. 4 miles of dirt road. She walked it in the cool of the morning, past the fields where people she knew were already bent to the cotton, and they lifted their heads to watch her go by in her town dress with her tablet, and more than one wondered where the Tolliver girl thought she was going. The Tallahatchie Milling Company was a long brick building down by the rail spur, with a smell of ground grain hanging over the whole block. The office was up front, through a door with a bell on it. Verna Lee stood outside that door longer than she wanted to admit. Then she made herself open it. The bell rang. She stepped in. There was a counter, and behind the counter a young clerk with his sleeves rolled and his hair oiled flat. He looked up. He took her in, top to bottom. The homemade dress and the bare-washed face and the school tablet and whatever he had been about to say, he decided against it. "Delivery's in the back," he said, not unkindly, just certain. Certain she was in the wrong place. "I'm not delivering, sir," Verna Lee said. "I came to ask about the flour sacks. We don't sell sacks here. Sacks go with the flour. You want the store." "No, sir, I don't want to buy 'em here. I know how the flour comes." She felt her heart going. She kept her voice level. "I want to ask about the patterns. The prints on the bags." The clerk set down his pen. Now he was a little amused, and it was worse than the certainty. "The patterns," he said. "Yes, sir, the coming ones. The new prints for this season." She took a breath, and she said the whole of it, the smallest version she had rehearsed the entire 4 miles. "Could I copy the patterns from your flour sacks? Into my own tablet. Here I wouldn't take a thing. I just want to draw 'em down, so I know what's coming, so I can buy the ones that match before the store sells the lot apart." For a moment the clerk just looked at her. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, a laugh at the strangeness of it. The idea that a girl would walk 4 miles to copy pictures off feed bags. "Honey," he said, "we don't do that. There's nothing here for you. You go on home." And that would have been the end of it. She would have turned around and walked her 4 miles back. And this story would be a story nobody ever told. Except for one thing. The door to the inner office was open, and a man in that office had been half listening. His name was Bertram Hollis. Everybody called him Bert. He was the manager of the whole works, and he was a tired man that spring, because he was losing an argument he could not admit he was in. The argument was about cloth. Tallahatchie's flour was as good as anybody's, but the brands that were beating him were not beating him on flour. They were beating him on bags. Women were buying the other man's flour because the other man's sacks made prettier dresses. Hollis knew it. And Hollis did not know the first thing about what made one print sell and another sit on the shelf. He picked the patterns the way he'd always picked them. He guessed. He would not have called it guessing. But that is what it was. So when a girl at his counter said the words flour sacks and patterns and which ones match, some tired part of Bert Hollis's mind pricked up its ears. He got up. He came out to the counter, and he waved the clerk back, and he looked at Verna Lee Tolliver for a long moment. "You sew," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, sir, out of the sacks. Yes, sir, 3 to a dress." He had samples. That was the thing. On a rack behind the counter, Tallahatchie kept the current printed sacks, flat and pinned, the way a store keeps carpet samples. A dozen of them, maybe more. Small florals, checks, a bold, big flowered print in red and green, stripes, a little geometric in blue. He looked at that rack, and he looked at the girl, and something got into him. Later he could not have told you what. "Before you copy him," Bert Hollis said, and there was half a smile on it, the smile of a man setting up a joke at nobody's expense. "Which of these do you figure sell?" The clerk grinned, waiting for the fun of it. Because everybody in that room knew the answer. The answer was that the girl would blink, and shrug, and have no idea. Because how would she? She sewed with what she could get. What could she know about selling? Verna Lee looked at the rack. She did not blink. She did not shrug. She took her time, the way she'd take her time over cloth, and then she raised her hand and pointed. Not at the big red and green flower, which was the prettiest thing on the rack, the one your eye went to first. She pointed past it, at a small, tight scatter of flowers on a medium tan ground. "That one," she said. "That one sells." Hollis's half-smile stayed put, but something behind it changed. And why's that? Because a woman can use it. She pointed then at the big flower, the pretty one. "That one's pretty in the store. It's a waist at the yoke. A flower that size, I lose half a yard just matching it up, and I've only got 3 bags to make the whole dress out of. Every woman who sews knows it the second she gets it home. She won't buy it twice." She dropped her hand. "The little one, there, every inch of that lands. Nothing wasted. She'll come back for that one and ask for it by the name on the flower." And the room went quiet. The clerk was not grinning anymore. Bert Hollis was standing very still, the way a man stands when the floor he thought was solid has just given a little under his foot. "Say that again," he said, "the part about the yoke." So she said it again, slower, and she said more, because now she could see he was truly listening, and she had never in her life had a person truly listen to her about this. She talked in the only language she owned, the language of a girl who has to get a whole dress out of 3 bags and not 1 thread more. "A big repeat," she said, "a big flower, a big check. It forces you to cut around it. You can't put a scissor through the middle of a flower and have it look like anything. So you cut to save the flowers whole, and that means you waste the cloth in between. At the yoke, at the placket, at the sleeve, that's where it costs you, because those are the little pieces. A big print, you might lose half a yard in a dress. Half a yard out of 3 bags, that's the difference between a dress and a dress with a pieced yoke you're ashamed of." She touched the little print again. "Small figures, close together, you can cut anywhere. Every piece lands right. There's no waste. A woman gets a whole dress and a little over. That's the one she buys." Hollis went to a drawer under the counter. He did it almost without thinking, the way you reach for something to catch yourself. He pulled out a paper. Verna Lee did not know what it was, but I will tell you what it was. It was last season's numbers, which brands and which prints had moved, and which had sat. Bert Hollis kept that ledger in a drawer, because he did not want the men over him to know how much of his picking was guessing. He looked at the paper. He looked at the rack. And her ranking, the order she'd have put those prints in, matched the order the ledger had already written in ink. The little scattered floral had outsold the big pretty flower nearly 2 to 1. She had known it in 10 seconds, standing at a counter, holding a school tablet. He had needed a whole year and a written record to know the same thing. Bert Hollis put the paper down very slowly. "Girl," he said, "what's your name?" "Verna Lee Tolliver, sir," he nodded, like the name was going somewhere he could find it again. Then he did something the clerk had never seen him do. He came around the counter, and he stood next to her, in front of the rack, the way 2 people stand who are looking at the same problem. "All right," he said. "Tell me about that one." He pointed at a print on a dark, busy ground, a small figure over a mottled medium brown. "That one I've never understood. It's not pretty. It's dull. but it moves. Why does that ugly thing move? And Verna Lee smiled a little, because this one was easy. This one she could have answered in her sleep. That's not an ugly print, sir. That's the smartest print you've got. She reached up and almost touched it. That ground. That busy middle color. You know what that hides? It hides a wash line. A dress gets washed 100 times on a scrub board. A pale ground shows every fade, shows where the sun got it, shows the line where the hem was let down. A busy medium ground like that, it fades even, and you never see it. And a mend. She said the word plain. You patch a dress like that, cut the patch on the same repeat, and nobody living can find the mend. A woman doesn't buy a print for how it looks the day she sews it. She buys it for how it looks the 50th time she washes it. That print's built to be lived in. That's why it moves. Hollis was quiet a good while. Nobody's ever said that to me, he said, in 20 years. Nobody in this building. Nobody up the line. Not one man. He turned and looked at her full on. You know why? Because not one of them ever cut a child's dress out of what the flower came in. You did. You're the only one who ever did. He was getting at something now, and it was rolling out ahead of him faster than he could keep up with it, the way a thing does when you've been circling it for years without seeing it. Wait, he said. Wait, do one more. That striped one. A simple stripe, running the length of the sack. What's smart about a stripe? That one reads the same from both ends, she said. Say what? Turn it top to bottom, it's the same. Flip it. It's the same. She looked at him steady. That matters more than any of it, and I bet no one's told you that either. Because the store's gonna break the lot apart. You know it. I know it. A woman never gets 3 sacks off the same shelf on the same day. She gets whatever 3 come to her hand, over a month, off a broke-up lot. If your print has a top and a bottom, or a right way and a wrong way, she can't match her seams. And she gets a dress that looks wrong even though she did everything right. But a print that reads the same from either end, she can sew any 3 together, any which way, and it comes out looking like you planned it. That's the print that never lets a woman down. That's the one she trusts. That's the one she asks for by name. There it was. The whole of it laid on the counter of the Tallahatchie Milling Company by a 17-year-old girl in a dress she had made herself. Bert Hollis stood there, and he understood all at once a thing he had been paid for years to understand, and never had. He was not really in the flower business, not the part that was killing him. He was in the cloth business. The bag was the reason a woman chose the brand, and the person who bought the flower, and the person who judged whether the sack was any good, and the person who wore the dress were all the same person, one woman. And in 20 years, nobody in the whole trade had ever once asked that woman a single question. They had guessed for her. They had guessed at her. And she had been standing there the entire time, knowing every answer, waiting for somebody to ask. You said you have a tablet, Hollis said. His voice had changed. The amusement was long gone. Something careful had come into it, something that was almost afraid of scaring off what it had found. Verna Lee set it on the counter and opened it. 11 designs, in pencil, careful and true, the colors noted at the edges in her own hand. Bright blue, egg yellow, rust. He turned the leaves one at a time and did not say a word for a long time. Then Bert Hollis looked up at her, and he asked her the question that would change everything, though neither of them yet knew how much. Verna Lee, he said, could you draw me one? A new one, made from the ground up for a single bag. Everything you just told me, all of it, built into one print. Could you do that? And Verna Lee Tolliver looked down at the empty leaf and picked up her pencil. She did not rush it. That was the first thing Hollis noticed. A man would have sketched fast, to show he could. Verna Lee sat down at the office table like she had all the daylight in the world, and she was still. For a moment, she only looked at the empty leaf. Then the pencil moved. She started with a single flower. Small, no bigger than a thumbnail. A 5-petal thing, plain as a field daisy, and beside it a scatter of little leaves that didn't point anywhere. She drew it once, careful. Then she drew it again, a half-inch over and a half-inch down, turned just slightly, so the eye couldn't catch the rhythm of it. Then again. And again. Hollis watched over her shoulder and said nothing. "You see how it doesn't line up in rows," she said, not looking up. "A row's the enemy. A woman lays her pattern piece down any which way, and every flower still lands whole. She never has to hunt for the top of it. There is no top of it. Go on. The ground." She tapped the white space between the figures. "That can't stay white. White shows a wash line the first hard summer, and it shows every place you've turned a hem or set a patch. So I fill it. Little sprigs. Small enough they read as texture from across a room. Busy enough they carry a mend right through the middle, and nobody ever sees it." She began salting the white with tiny marks. Quick, sure, a print has to survive being lived in. 10 washings on a rub board. A knee gone through and set again. It has to still look like the same dress after all that. Most prints don't. Most prints are made to look pretty folded on a shelf. This one's made to look pretty on a child who's been climbing. She worked the color notes into the margin the way she always did. Bright blue. Egg yellow. A soft rust. A green that leaned gray. And one thin line of deep red, the smallest amount, just to lift the whole thing. 5 colors, she said. No more. Every color past that costs you at the roller and shows at the register when they don't line up clean. 5's plenty. 5's a garden. Then she turned the tablet on the table, all the way around, so the drawing faced Hollis upside down. She slid it back to herself and turned it again. "Look at it both ways," she said. "It reads the same. That's the last rule, and it's the one nobody thinks of. When the store gets a bale of these bags, they don't keep them together. They sell the flour out of them one at a time, to whoever comes. A woman gets 3 sacks over a month, and they were never side by side in the pile. So the print can't have an up and a down. If it does, she's ruined. 2 of her sacks face one way, and one faces the other, and the dress fights itself at the seam." She set the pencil flat. "This one doesn't care. Turn it any way you please. It's a garden from every side." She had built the whole of what she'd told him. Every constraint folded into one small, honest square of pencil. She squared the edges of the leaf with 2 fingers, and she pushed the tablet across the counter to him. "That's the one I'd want," she said. "If I could buy it." Bert Hollis picked it up with both hands. He held it a long time. He was thinking about the geometry of it, though he didn't have her words for it yet. He measured it in his head against a 100-pound sack. The repeat sat inside a single bag panel like it had been cut to fit, because it had. Nothing lost in the fold. Nothing wasted at the top and bottom hem where the printing died into the seam. He had ordered cloth for 20 years and never once thought about the fold. She had thought about nothing else, because she was the one who had to iron it flat and lay the pattern down and get a child's whole dress out of what came in the door. "I'm going to send this up the line," Hollis said. "To Kansas City. There's a company prints our bags. Keystone. I want to show them what a bag ought to be." Verna Lee gathered her tablet back to her chest. "You keep the drawing," she said. "I've got it up here." She touched her temple, and for the first time all afternoon she almost smiled. She walked the 4 miles home in the last of the light. She did not tell her mother she had drawn anything. She said only that the man had let her copy the patterns, and that had been true enough to carry through supper. The letter to Keystone went out the next morning in Hollis's own hand. He did a thing he was not in the habit of doing. He wrote down where the design had come from. A local girl. A sharecropper's daughter. He wrote that she understood the trade better than any man he'd bought art from, and he meant it. And he did not yet know how little that sentence would be worth to the men who read it. Roy Prentice read it in an office in Kansas City with his hat still on. Prentice was the company's salesman, the go-between, the one who priced things. He read Hollis's letter twice. He looked at the drawing a good while longer than he let on. Because it was good, and he knew it was good. And knowing it was good was exactly why he did what he did next. He set it down. He lit a cigarette. And he decided, right there, what the girl was worth to him, which was as close to nothing as he could arrange, while still calling it a fair deal. "Tell Hollis we'll take it," he said to the man across the desk. $9. Flat. No royalty. Nothing in writing about her. And the pattern registers to the company. It's our print the day the check clears. He tapped the ash. You don't sign the flower. You don't sign the sack. The word came back down the line to Egret 4 days later. Hollis carried it out to the Tolliver place himself, which was not a thing a mill manager did, and Cleo Tolliver watched his automobile come up the section road with her hand pressed flat to her chest the whole way. A millman coming to the house was not, in her experience, a thing that ever meant good news for a cropper. It meant a debt called early. It meant the furnish cut off. She had every reason built into her bones to expect the worst. They sat at the kitchen table. All of them. Elmer with his hat in his lap. Cleo standing by the stove because she could not make herself sit. Dosia and Nettie in the doorway, told twice to go and not going. And Verna Lee across from Hollis, still. The way she had been still at the office table. Hollis laid it out plain. He was not a man to dress a thing up. They want it, he said. That's the good part, and it's real. Keystone's going to print it. He turned his hat once in his hands. The rest of it I'm ashamed to carry. $9. One time. And your name goes nowhere. The company owns the print outright. The kitchen was quiet enough to hear the fire. $9. Elmer turned the figure over. $9 was 2 months of chopping cotton, bent double in the Delane rows, for the whole family, for one afternoon of his daughter sitting at a table with a pencil. Said one way, it was a fortune fallen out of the sky. Said the other way, and Elmer, who could not read much, could still count. It was $9 against a run of sacks he could not even picture. Tens of thousands of them. His daughter's garden on every one, going out to stores he'd never see, and the family's whole share of it fitting in his shirt pocket. "It ain't right," Elmer said. It was almost the only thing he said the whole hour. The number ain't the trouble. The number's the biggest number this family's ever been offered at one time. But it ain't right. And I know it ain't. And I don't have the words for why. "I have the words," Verna Lee said. They looked at her. "It's not the $9, she said. "The $9 is more than fair for an afternoon. If that's all it was, I'd take it and thank him." She folded her hands on the table. "It's the name. They want to say the company drew it. They want the record to read that a man in Kansas City thought of it. And it isn't so. I thought of it. Every rule in it I learned with a rub board and a pair of scissors and no cloth to waste. A woman in some town I'll never see is going to put that print on her daughter, because it's the one that doesn't let her down. And the paper's going to say a company did that." She was not angry. That was the thing that frightened Cleo more than anger would have. She was flat and clear as still water. "I don't mind them getting rich off it. Let them. There's plenty of it. I mind them saying, I was never here." Cleo Tolliver spoke then, from over by the stove, and her voice shook. "Take the $9, Verna Lee." She was crying and trying not to. "Take it and let it be. A cropper's girl does not win an argument with a company. She only finds out how much they can take when she makes them cross. We have got to live on this land. We have got to draw furnish from that commissary come July, or we do not eat. You cannot go making a mill office angry over a name. A name will not feed Nettie." She wiped her face hard with the flat of her hand. "I begged you not to walk to that town. I begged you. I know you did, Mama. Then take the money." And Verna Lee looked at her mother a long moment, and what was in her face was not defiance. It was something harder for Cleo to bear, because it was patience. "I'll take the money," Verna Lee said. "I'm not a fool. $9 is $9, and we need it." She turned to Hollis. "I'll take it. But I want you to try one thing first. Not for money. I've given up the money. Try for the name." Bert Hollis went back to Tallahatchie that evening, and he could not sleep. He knew he could not win the royalty. He had spent enough years in the trade to know exactly which fights ended a man's usefulness to a company like Keystone, and asking them to pay a Delta girl on every sack for 20 years was that fight. And he would lose it and lose his own place besides, and she would still get nothing. So he did not fight that one. He was too good at his job to waste himself on a fight he could not win. He found the 1 inch he could take instead. The next morning he got Roy Prentice on the telephone, and he did not argue justice, because Prentice had no ear for it. He argued the only language Prentice spoke. "Roy," Hollis said, "forget the girl a minute. Let's talk money." "Yours." He leaned on the wall by the telephone. "You've got a bag that's going to move flour off a shelf faster than anything Keystone's ever run. You know why? Because a woman's going to choose the brand for the cloth, and this is the cloth. Now, what sells a print faster than a pretty print?" He waited. "A pretty print with a name on it. A print a woman can ask for. You put a line in the selvage, right there on the edge, woven in. Costs you next to nothing on the loom, and it reads that a real person made it. A Delta girl who sews. And every store clerk from here to Memphis starts hearing women ask for it by name. That's not charity, Roy. That's the cheapest advertising a bag company ever bought. It's woven right into the goods and it never washes out, and you never pay for a billboard again." There was a long silence on the Kansas City end. Prentice did not like it. Prentice understood, dimly, that he was being outsmarted with his own arithmetic, and he did not enjoy the feeling. But he could count too, and the count came out the way Hollis had built it to come out. A name in the selvage cost him almost nothing, and if it moved even a little more flour, it paid. He could not make the numbers say no. "The edge line," Prentice said at last. "Sour, fine in the selvage. Nowhere else. And it's still our print." "She takes the $9. She takes the $9, Hollis agreed. "And her name goes in the goods. Whatever moves the run." "Then move the run," Hollis said. "How many?" He heard Prentice shuffle a paper. He heard the number before Prentice said it, almost, because he had already begun to believe in the thing himself. "First order," Prentice said. 40,000 sacks. 40,000. Bert Hollis stood with the receiver in his hand after the line went dead, and he said the number out loud to the empty office. Just to hear it in the room. 40,000 sacks. 40,000 dresses worth of a garden a 17-year-old girl had drawn upside down on butcher paper to prove it read the same from either end. The rollers at Keystone ran that print for 11 days. The Kansas City floor was a place of noise and iron and the smell of hot ink. The presses stood taller than a man, great engraved copper cylinders, one for each color, and the cloth came off them not as bags but as a river, a running flood of white goods flowering into color as it passed under each roller in turn. Blue, then yellow, then the rust, then the gray-green, then, last, that one thin line of deep red she had held back to the very end, and the whole thing lifted and came alive. A floor foreman named Doss walked the length of it the third day with his sleeves rolled, checking registration, making sure the colors sat true. He knew good cloth. He'd run a lot of it. And he stopped, because this was good cloth, and he crouched down at the selvage where the edge of the goods ran. And he read the little woven line that repeated there down the whole length of the bolt. He read it twice. Then he called over the man from the company who was standing about with his hat on. "Prentice," Doss said. "This here in the edge. This a name?" Roy Prentice came and looked at where the foreman's blunt finger lay against the running cloth. Verna Lee Tolliver, woven right into the selvage, over and over, all down the 40,000. "Who is that?" Doss said. Not really a question. A man reading a name off a bolt and wanting to know whose hand was in the work. This the artist? This one of ours up in the office? And Roy Prentice, who had priced her at $9 and no name, who had said you don't sign the sack, stood on his own print floor with his own foreman waiting on him, and he opened his mouth, and he found there was no answer in it that would fit. He could not say a company drew it. The foreman was holding the cloth. He could not say nobody. The name was right there in his hand, running away from him 1,000 times a minute. He could not say a sharecropper's girl in Mississippi, because the foreman would ask why a sharecropper's girl's name was in Keystone's goods, and Keystone's money was not in the sharecropper's girl, and Prentice did not want to hear how that sounded out loud on his own floor. "Somebody down the line," he said finally, and turned away. "It's just marketing." Doss looked at the name a moment more. Then he stood, and he ran his hand flat along the cloth, the way a man does when he respects the goods, and he said, mostly to himself, "Well, it's a good bag, whoever she is." The bolt kept running. 40,000. Her name went into every yard. The first sacks came back down to Tallahatchie 2 weeks after that. Bert Hollis took one off the top of the first bale himself. He shook it out flat. And then he did a small, careful thing. He folded it so the selvage lay up, the woven edge turned to show, the name running along it clear. And he set it on the counter of his own office, the same counter where a girl in a homemade dress had stood a season ago and asked the smallest question a person could ask. He sent word to the Tolliver place. She came the 4 miles in. The same young clerk was at the counter, the one who had half laughed at her, the one who had nearly turned her out the door before Hollis ever came from the back. He did not laugh this time. He had heard by now whose ranking had matched the ledger, and he had learned to be quiet. Hollis came out and put his hand flat on the folded sack. "Go on," he said. "That's yours to touch first." Verna Lee turned the sack over in her hands. She found the selvage. She read her own name in the cloth, woven in, 100 times down the edge, and she did not say anything for a while. Her thumb moved over the letters like a woman reading in the dark. "It reads the same both ways," she said at last. "Quiet." I checked it turned around. "It works." "It works," Hollis said. "It's the best moving bag on my floor already, and it's been out 2 weeks." He cleared his throat. He was not a soft man, and this was hard for him. "There's a thing came with the order. Keystone wants you. In Kansas City. On salary, to draw. They'll pay a real wage, and there's more where this one came from. And I told them I'd carry the offer, but the answer was yours." He tapped the counter once. "But that's for later. Right now I've got a simpler thing to ask you." He looked at her. "Bring me 4 more. And behind him, the young clerk, the one who had nearly sent her home unheard, picked up the bolt of the run and carried it to the door and held it open for her, both arms full, so she could walk out into the light with her name in her hands. 400 miles from Egret, in a Delta town nobody in the Tolliver house had ever seen, a farm woman stood at a grocer's counter that same month. She had a sack of the flour already, at home, in the good print. She'd made an apron out of it, and half a dress, and she wanted the mate before the store broke the lot apart the way stores always did. So she asked the grocer plain, "You getting more of the Tolliver print?" The grocer looked up from his figures. "The what?" "The Tolliver. The little flower one, blue and yellow, reads the same top and bottom." She had it exact. She had never met the girl, and never would, and she had her figured to the letter. "It's the one that don't waste. You get me 3 of those before you sell them apart. I'll take all 3 today and pay now." The grocer had no idea Tolliver was a person. He thought it was a brand, a company, a thing stamped somewhere in an office. He wrote it down the way she said it. Tolliver, 3 sacks, hold together. And that was the thing no register in Kansas City could ever take, and the thing Roy Prentice never understood he had failed to buy for his $9. The paper said the company owned the print. But 400 miles off, a woman who'd never heard the name as a name was asking for it as one anyway, asking for her, by her, choosing the brand because of her, and there was no clause in any contract that could make that woman ask for it any other way. Back in Egret, on the porch, Dosha and Nettie stood in the last good light in matched dresses. Verna Lee had cut them from 3 sacks of the run. Dosha 13, Nettie 10, both of them turning slow so the fabric caught the sun. And you could not tell, looking, that the three sacks had never been side by side in any pile, that Nettie's front panel had come to the house facing one way and her back panel the other. The print did not fight itself at the seam. It was a garden from every side, exactly as drawn, and the two girls looked, for once in their lives, like the pattern had been chosen for them on purpose, by somebody who knew them. Because it had. "It's the prettiest thing I ever had on," Nettie said, and she said it the way a child says a true thing, without knowing it was the whole point of everything. Verna Lee sat on the step and watched them turn. She thought about the girl who had walked to town in the spring to ask if she might copy a pattern. That girl had asked for permission to look. She had thought her whole life's worth was in being allowed to look at what other people made and copy it careful, so she'd lose a little less. And then a man had turned one question around on her: "Which of these do you figure sell?" And it turned out she had not been copying at all. She had been the one who knew. The same girl. One question apart. The girl who came to copy the pattern and the girl who was asked which one sold were the same girl standing in the same dress. And the only thing that had changed was that somebody, once, had finally asked. The tablet sat on her knee. It had held 11 copied designs when she carried it to town. Now the copied ones were behind her, and the front leaves were filling with new ones, her own from the ground up. 1, 2, 3. She was most of the way through the fourth. Hollis had asked for 4 more, and she would have them by the weekend. And after that, there was Kansas City to think about. A real wage, and a drawing table, and a city she could not picture. They talked about it again that night at the kitchen table, all of them, and they did not decide. Cleo was afraid of it still. Elmer wanted it, and was afraid to want it. Verna Lee turned it over slow, and said maybe, and said not yet, and said it was a thing worth thinking hard about. And nobody got angry, and nobody settled it, and that the fact that it sat there on the table as theirs to weigh. Out loud in their own kitchen, a choice a Tolliver got to make instead of a thing a Tolliver got handed, that was itself the whole of what had changed. A season ago, the biggest news that ever came up that section road was a debt. Now the news was an open door, and it was theirs to walk through or not, as they saw fit. Somewhere in an office in Kansas City there is a memo, filed and forgotten. That says the print was drawn in-house and belongs to the company. It is still there. Paper keeps. But the paper is not what the woman 400 miles off asked for at the grocer's counter. She asked for the Tolliver print. She asked for it by name, because it was the one that never let her down, the one she trusted, the one built by the only person in that whole long trade who had ever once cut a child's dress out of what the flour came in, and been asked, at last, what she knew. She asked for permission to copy the patterns. She turned out to be the only person in the building who could tell you why one sold and another didn't. Comment the pattern your family sewed by. I want to see how far this print still travels.